Walking into a room or a building or an event for the very first time can be intimidating. You walk into this place you're going, maybe it's even church. You walk in for the very first time and you look around and you wonder, am I going to be accepted? Are people going to accept me? Am I dressed right? Do I look right? Am I going to be part of the group? Walking into an event for the first time can be intimidating because we are not sure if people are going to like us or accept us. Well, in today's lesson, we're going to pick up in Mark chapter 7. And Jesus is going to spend some time outside of the main Jewish area of the region. He's going to spend some time with some people who might feel rejected, who might not feel like others are going to accept them. So let's pick up today in Mark chapter 7, verse 24 through 30. He got up and departed from there to the region of Tyre. He entered the house and did not want anyone to know it, but he could not escape notice. Instead, immediately after hearing about him, a woman whose daughter had an unclean spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she was asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, because it isn't right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she replied to him, "Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he told her, "Because of this reply you may go. The demon has left your daughter." And when she went back to her home, she found her child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. Now, upon first glance, we might look at this passage and go, "Jesus, you sound kind of rude here. Jesus, you sound kind of mean here." But I think we need to look at the context, look at what's going on to understand really what Jesus is saying and to understand this woman's response. First off, we need to understand the cultural context of the conversation that's happening. Look back at the text and look at some things about this woman. First, we see that she was, yes, a woman. She was a mother. She was a Gentile, which means she wasn't a Jew. She seemed to respect Jesus. She does fall down and call him Lord, and she's tenacious, and she has faith. So let's look at two aspects of this conversation that might deem it unacceptable to some. First off, this woman was a Gentile. Now, Jews and Gentiles didn't generally get along. Jews tend to look down on Gentiles because of their cultural and religious practices, and Gentiles tend to dominate Jews both politically and with authority and things like that. But also, not just was she a Gentile, but she was a woman, and Jesus was a rabbi. In this day and age, men tended to dominate women, and rabbis were generally not seen to be talking to women. They weren't to go up and just have a conversation with a woman, especially one they don't know, and especially one who is a Gentile. You see, in Jesus' world, this woman was an outcast. She wasn't someone that a good, God-fearing, God-teaching man like Jesus would be hanging out with. I want us to take just a moment and I want us to consider something. What groups might be considered outsiders today? And what obstacles keep believers from sharing the gospel with them? Now, based on the culture of Jesus' day, he should not be talking to this woman. Based on the culture of that day, people would look down on him for talking to this woman. There were barriers in the way of his conversation. In our day today, there are barriers that might stand in the way of us having a conversation with someone that's different from us, different socioeconomically, someone who's different in race, someone who's different in culture. There are things that stand between us and sharing the gospel with other people. And we tend to forget in our day and age that Jesus stepped over those barriers in his day. And Jesus commands us to do the same thing. In Acts 1:8, when he told his followers to go to Samaria, he was telling them to go to someone who's different, step across a cultural barrier and share the gospel. And so Jesus, in this conversation, he's showing us that we need to step across those barriers because he did it. Because he wanted to share the gospel with this woman. You see, culture wouldn't let him, but he said, no, there's something more important than culture. There's something more important than a socioeconomic standing. There's something more important than race, and I've got to step across that barrier, and I've got to share the gospel with this woman, share the love of Christ with this woman. But we got to get back to that conversation they had, that weird conversation where Jesus sounds kind of rude. Go back and look with me again at Mark chapter 7, verse 27. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Let's begin by understanding the words Jesus is using in this conversation. Let's begin with the word dog. Now, Jesus here isn't talking about a mangy street scavenger roaming around Tyre. The word Jesus actually uses is the word for puppy. So imagine in your head the family at the table. And they're eating dinner, and you got the kids there, and they've got their food in front of them, and below them are some puppies. You know how puppies are? They want a little snack. They want your attention. Jesus says the food on the table is for the children, not the puppies. Now again, this still might sound a little rude to be talking to this woman and saying, I can't talk to you because the food is for children, not dogs. But Jesus is speaking in a parable-like fashion. So what's he saying? He's saying my ministry, what I'm here right now on this earth doing is aimed at the Jews. It's aimed at the people who are part of God's covenant family. It's aimed at the people who are expecting the Messiah. I've got to get this across to them first. I like this quote. Jesus implied that there was a place for Gentiles. It was just not then. Their time would come. This woman tenaciously responds to Jesus. She says, yes, the food on the table is for the children, but even the puppies, they get scraps. Even the puppies get the crumbs that fall on the floor. You see, Jesus said there is a place for Gentiles, it's just not yet. And her response is, why not? Her response is, I need it now. Her response is, I want it now, because she had tenacious faith in Jesus. She knew who he was. She says, yes, Jesus, I know you're here for the Jews, but can't we have a little bit of your ministry? Can't we have a little bit of your power? Can't we have a little bit of your teaching? Can't we have a little bit of your love? She says, I want to seize the moment. You're here. You're in my region. Help me. Help my daughter, she says. I want you to take a moment. I said she was tenacious. I said she had faith. But what else might we learn about this woman? Just take a moment and consider that. This woman was a woman of great faith. She was a woman who knew who Jesus was, and she had faith in him. She was a woman who wasn't going to let cultural barriers stand in her way. She wasn't going to let what other people might think about her going to see the rabbi, what they might say. She wasn't going to let that stay in her way. She was going to overcome those barriers. A woman of faith who would do what it takes to take care of her daughter. But also we see in this woman a foreshadowing. We see a foreshadowing from the day when the gospel will go to the Gentiles. A day when those apostles and those followers of Jesus are going to step across cultural barriers and go because they're following Jesus. And that's what Jesus did in his life. He knew he was here for the Jews, but he was also here for other people, here for the Gentiles. So we get a picture of what is to come in the future when people step across cultural barriers and share the gospel. So let's keep going. Let's see what else happens while Jesus is out of the main Jewish region of the area. Look at Mark chapter 7, verse 31. Again, leaving the region of Tyre, he went by way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee. Through the region of the Decapolis, they brought to him a deaf man who had difficulty speaking and begged Jesus to lay his hand on him. So he took him away from the crowd in private. After putting his fingers in the man's ears and spitting, he touched his tongue. Looking up to heaven, he sighed deeply and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. Immediately his ears were opened and his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak clearly. Now, I told you Jesus left the main Jewish area to go off to Tyre and to get away. And it seems that he might have been getting away to rest, getting away from things just a little bit. You see, he travels from Tyre to Sidon over to the Decapolis. And Mark gives us no mention of preaching during this time. So it's possible that Jesus was just trying to get away for a bit. The trip that he took, though, was 120 miles from Tyre all the way across to the Decapolis. And he gets to this area, and it's named for 10 cities. The Deca is 10 cities, and it's a largely Gentile area. Jesus has been to this area before, but Jesus is here today, and he's going to encounter a deaf man. And look, what does it say happened? Jesus took him away from the crowd. He put his fingers in the man's ear. He spit and touched his tongue. He looked up to heaven. He sighed deeply and said, be opened. And there's a lot going on here in this passage, but I want to focus on the communication aspect of the passage. I want us to see that Jesus is going to communicate with the man, with the Father, and Mark's going to communicate to the Gentile readers of his book. First off, Jesus is communicating to the man. Many times people love to see Jesus do miracles. They love the spectacle of the thing. But in this case, Jesus pulls the man aside. And he communicates to him in a way that the man can understand. Because remember, the man can't hear and he can't speak well. So Jesus puts his fingers in the man's ears. I think Jesus is communicating to this man through signs and actions. I'm going to take care of your hearing problem. Because the man didn't know why Jesus was taking him away. And so Jesus says, I'm going to take care of your hearing problem by putting his fingers in his ear. Then Jesus spits and touches the man's tongue. And while that might sound gross to us, Jesus is communicating again, I think, to the man, I'm going to take care of your speaking problem. See, Jesus is overcoming physical barriers to communicate to the man. Earlier, we talked about Jesus overcoming cultural barriers in ministering to the woman. I want us to take a moment. I want us to get really practical for just a second. And I want you to think of some practical ways, actionable things you can do to overcome both cultural and physical barriers in communicating the gospel to other people. One key to overcoming cultural and physical barriers to sharing the gospel with people is the practice of being present, being aware of what's around you, being aware of people's spiritual needs. And we need to show compassion and mercy on people. Sometimes physical and cultural barriers get in the way of us having compassion and showing mercy, and we need to move past those barriers, and we need to show mercy and compassion as a means of showing the gospel to people. So Jesus communicates with the man. Jesus communicates with the Father. It says that he prayed to the Father and asked, open the man's eyes. Jesus, regardless of who he is in his divinity, he's also a man who communicates to the Father. And we need to communicate with the Father. When we are trying to step over cultural and physical barriers to share compassion and mercy as a means of sharing the gospel to people, we need to rely on the Father's power. Rely on his ability to strengthen us, give us wise words, give us a soft heart. Rely on him to help us share the gospel. So Jesus communicates to the man, he communicates to the Father, and Mark communicates to the Gentile reader. You see, most people who read Mark's gospel initially were probably Gentiles. So Mark is communicating something else to them here. He says Jesus had great empathy on this man. He sighed deeply. He was concerned for this man. And Mark is communicating to his Gentile readers that Jesus was concerned not just about the Jews, but about this Gentile man. In other words, Jesus is concerned for all kinds of people. Jesus doesn't just feel deeply for his own kind. He feels deeply for others, for people who are different from him. And we need to do so likewise. We show empathy and compassion for people. It's a way of sharing the gospel with them. So Jesus has stepped across cultural barriers in helping this woman and her daughter. Jesus is stepping across cultural and physical barriers to communicate with this man in a way that this man can understand, and then taking care of him and healing him. You see, Jesus is stepping across all these barriers because Jesus is here for all of us. But let's keep trucking. Let's see what happens next in Mark's gospel. Look at Mark chapter 7, verse 36. He ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more they proclaimed it. They were extremely astonished and said, he has done everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. In these verses, we are reminded of Jesus' ministry and his person. You see, we've seen this before. Jesus sometimes will heal somebody or do something great, and he'll say, don't tell anybody. Now, that might sound like a difficult command to keep, but Jesus is doing it for a purpose. Jesus is remembering, is being reminded, and is always staying focused on why he's here. He's not here to be a Hellenistic miracle worker and gather people around him who are just awed by him and like him or excited about him and want to see a spectacle. Jesus is focused on his mission, which is to go to the cross and to be the Savior of mankind. You see, Jesus wasn't, his person and his reality of who he is wasn't going to be realized until after his death. So Jesus wants to stay focused on that mission, that gospel mission. And that's a reminder to us too. While we might meet people's needs, while we might have compassion on them and meet a physical need, or meet an emotional need, or meet a mental need, or whatever it may be, as we meet their needs, we need to stay focused on the gospel mission. Because when we meet a need with a gospel focus, people respond like these people responded. How'd they respond? First, we see that they could not keep quiet. Now, while it's true, these people should have kept Jesus' command and not spoken about what he did, they just could not. The word Mark uses here is they were astonished. And that word in the Greek is not used anywhere else in prominent Greek literature. You see, it has a sense of fear, panic, astonishment. They were astonished at what they had seen, what had happened, because they knew this man. They knew his life story, and they were just awed by what Jesus did. Jesus often did miracles that people were astonished, but this right here, Mark is showing us this is off the charts. These people are just dumbfounded. And it's almost like Mark has to make up a word to describe how amazed they were at what Jesus did. But also we see that they responded by declaring, whether they knew it or not, that Jesus was the Messiah. He has done everything well, they said. That phrase harkens back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. Remember, God's created everything. And verse 31 says, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good indeed. Jesus is acting in a way that recalls the creative power of God. Whether they know it or not, they're saying he's like God. They're saying he's something about this guy. See, they're talking about his messiahship and don't even know it. But he's healed this man, this deaf man, this mute man, and that calls to mind the words of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah 35, 5 through 6 says, Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will sing for joy. The water will gush in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. Jesus is fulfilling the words written centuries earlier. He is the Messiah that was prophesied, and he is God in flesh. And he is stepping over cultural barriers. He's stepping over physical barriers to communicate his love and the gospel message. That's a word for us. You see, today, Jesus has done all these things, and they're a picture to remind us that we need to do them daily. We need to take the gospel to people who are different than us, take the gospel to people who have physical needs, show compassion and mercy and empathy with them as we help them out in life and do so for a gospel mission. We've been talking about all these things today. I asked you earlier to think about some practical ways that you can step across some barriers. I really want you to do that. If you are watching this with a group, or if you're going to meet with a group later after watching this, or even if it's just you alone, I want you to very practically think of some ways that you can step across some barriers. What are some things that you can and will do in the coming days and weeks to step across a cultural barrier, to share the gospel, to share the love of Christ, that you have the ability to share the gospel? What are some ways that you can step across some physical barriers? Who are some people in our community, in your community, who are separated from you because of a physical disability or because of a difference? What are some ways you can step across a barrier and share the love of Christ with them and then share the gospel with them and their families? I really want to challenge you to do that this week. Jesus has shown us that even when he went away to get some rest, he still did ministry. Even when he was in a place where people were different than him, he still did ministry. Even when he was in a place where a man could not communicate with him, he did ministry. How will you do that this week? How will you follow in the example of Jesus this week? I'll see you next week.